So moving on to section 2 of Gustafson's grief, I want to point out two things right away. First of all, in the opening sentences, we actually get a first definition of grief. It is not the definition that he will be offering as his answer to what grief actually is. I'll take a look at that. And secondly, what is section 2? Section 2 is a survey of, let's say, research results, you might say, about the emotions in general, not grief in particular, but emotions in general, what sort of things they are. And several things are pointed out here that will be crucial to his account of grief. So we wanted to make sure that we know what they are. But what we have first is an attempt to define grief. And again, it is not his final attempt. If we look at the opening sentences of section 2 here on page 458, the emotion of grief evidently should share with other emotions their involvement with beliefs, judgings, or with so taking the world as to warrant or justify the emotion and its affects or feelings. This is the notion that, as we'll see, he has this notion that some emotions, not all, but many emotions, are cognitively penetrable. Insofar as we can say they're not just free-floating emotions, they're about something, they're prompted by something, and they're associated with our belief about something to be true. So there's a cognitive, cognitive means about knowledge or concerning knowledge. There's a cognitive aspect to some emotions. But then he says, as a first approximation, grief might be something like a deep unhappiness, essentially tied to a belief or judgment that someone has died. Now that's to say that grief would have two elements to it. One, the feeling element of an unhappiness, and two, the cognitive element of a belief or judgment that someone has died. Let's just make sure that we understand that. Unhappiness is a feeling, but a belief or judgment that someone has died is a cognitive thing. That is, it has to do with knowledge or what we think we know. So this first pass, which again is not his definition of grief, would be to say that grief is unhappiness tied to a belief that someone has died. As we'll see in the next section, that's not bad. It's just that it's missing an element. And we'll see what that element is. That is that his definition of grief will end up having three elements, not two. So in looking at this survey of philosophical or psychological research or commentary on the emotions in general, some important things are set up. And the first is that emotions are, as he says here at the bottom of page 458, emotions are partially determined by considerations. That is, considerations, as he says here, their emotions are cognitively penetrable in the sense that they're not just feelings sometimes. There are feelings associated with beliefs or cognitions. And certainly grief will be. That is, to say that grief is unhappiness tied to a judgment that someone has died is to say that it's cognitively penetrable. Grief is not just a free-floating feeling, it's about something. It's both prompted by something and it's about something. We grieve over something. We don't just grieve. Now, some emotions are free-floating emotions, as he says here at the bottom of 458. By contrast, some fears, for example, sudden fright, some perceptions, and sensations and the like, are cognitively impenetrable. That is, you might just sort of feel sad, or you might have some kind of internal state that's not really tied to a specific belief or judgment. What's another important aspect that he's pointing out here, which is related to the cognitive penetrability of emotions, is something that was suggested earlier in the essay, and that is that emotions can be rationally evaluated. That is, insofar as some emotions it's rational to fear and some it's irrational. Some emotions it's rational to feel in particular circumstances, and other emotions or emotional states can be irrational. As he says, if emotions are cognitively penetrable in that they are partially determined by associated beliefs, judgments, or appraisals, then they are equally, and for that reason, open to some degree of rational valuation, to the giving of reasons. They can be rationally grounded or warranted or unwarranted. As well, they can fail in these regards and are subject to types of irrationality. That'll be explained further, but he gives some examples later on. This is on page 461, where he talks about rational valuation. An emotion can be warranted or unwarranted. That is, the feeling of emotion can be warranted or unwarranted. What would be some of the unwarranted or irrational emotional states? Well, let's say if they were based upon a belief or judgment which was obviously false. He gives the example of someone may feel joy, the emotion of joy, because under the belief that they've won some sort of competition when they clearly have not, and the belief is delusional. Let's say someone may feel happy over something happening, but if that something obviously didn't happen, then we would say that that emotional state is irrational, is unwarranted. Other reasons for calling an emotional state irrational would be the degree of emotion or feeling that we have in response to it, like overreacting to something. He says, as he says here, a person may be in a rage over an event which in his typical behavior would not offend him. That is, if somebody just goes ballistic over a small thing, we would say that their emotional state is irrational because they've overreacted. That would be an irrational state. And then finally, there are some desires that would just be in themselves irrational. Like he gives the example of somebody who wishes that all cats should die and then sees a cat in his neighbor's yard and just goes nuts. That's just an inherently irrational state, right? So what he's trying to set up here is the idea that emotions aren't just these random things. I mean, sometimes they are. Sometimes we feel free-floating anxiety, depression, joy, happiness that really can't be tied to any kind of belief or any kind of circumstances. But sometimes we feel emotions, and they certainly can be in these well understood senses that he gives. I mean, if someone were to feel joy or sadness at an event that was clearly not true, is a belief that would be irrational. We know that sometimes we do that, or sometimes people do that. If somebody overreacts or underreacts, that is the strength of the emotion, the strength of the feeling. Or if somebody just has a crazy sort of, they go fly into a rage because they see a cat in their neighbor's yard. That would be another example. So the idea here is that emotions can be thought of in this way. It's not just sort of these things that happen, but these things that happen under certain circumstances so that they're either warranted or unwarranted. Another important part of this section is that he introduces the idea of the conative aspects of emotion. This is on page 462. Make that a little bigger. Conative is one of those philosophy words. It just means having to do with feeling. And that will be a very important part of his definition, G, of grief, that he'll introduce in the next section. But one of the things that he says about the conative aspects of emotion, that is, conative, I'm sorry if I said feeling, I meant desire. Conative has to do with desires. And we'll see that. It's not feeling, it's this desire or want that conative designates. But that is something that we want is involved in the emotion. This will be quite important in his definition of grief because he will include a conative aspect. That's really the third aspect, a desiring aspect. And one of the things he says about the conative aspects of emotion, he says here, they provide motive force and are apt for producing actions. That is, desires, wants, are apt for making us do things. That is, if I have a desire or a want for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that is not necessarily going to make me get up and make myself one, but it certainly will sometimes result in that, or it will push me to do it. If I have an aversion to the smell in a certain room, that is a kind of anti-desire, but it also will prompt me to do something about it, to get out of the room or to try to find the source of the smell and get rid of it or something like that. So the conative aspect is important, very important, because it's apt to make us do things. And as we'll see in his definition of grief, that is a very important aspect of his definition of grief. And you can anticipate that one of the big parts of that is that in grief, there's nothing that we can do, yet we do have this desire to do something.